The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like fresh paint and recycled air. Someone had renovated recently. The walls were still that particular shade of white that hasn't settled yet. Too bright, almost aggressive. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. 40 years of walking into rooms like this will do that to you. My son David sat to my left, his hands folded on the table in a way that reminded me of how he used to sit in church when he was 9 years old, perfectly still on the outside, terrified underneath. Stephanie sat across from him. Her attorney, Marcus Webb, had his folder open and his pen uncapped. Stephanie had her hands flat on the table, and she was smiling the way people smile when they've already decided how a conversation ends. She looked at David and said it clearly, without hesitation, without looking at me at all. He'll apologize or sign away everything. Those are the only two options on the table today. David didn't answer. He looked at me instead. I don't know what he was looking for. I kept my face still and said nothing. Marcus Webb nodded slowly, as if the ultimatum were reasonable, as if it were simply the next item on an agenda. He said something about the terms being clearly outlined in the prenuptial agreement. He said the language was unambiguous. He said Stephanie had been patient. Across the table, Rachel Chen opened her copy of the document without expression. Rachel had been my attorney for 11 years. I had seen her in 3 arbitrations and 1 federal deposition, and I had never once seen her open a folder quickly. She opened this one the same way, methodical, unhurried, like a woman who already knew what was inside and had already decided what to do with it. She turned to page 4. Stephanie's smile held, but her hand stopped moving. She had been tapping one finger against the table, a small, steady rhythm I'd been tracking since we sat down, and it stopped the moment Rachel turned that page. I don't think Stephanie noticed she'd done it. I noticed. Rachel began to read. The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, the kind that arrives when everyone present understands that something is about to change, and no one is certain yet who it will change for. David was watching Rachel. Marcus Webb had stopped nodding. Stephanie was still smiling, but her eyes had moved from David to the document in Rachel's hands, and they hadn't moved back. I looked at my son. He was 36 years old, and he still sat like that 9-year-old boy in church, hands folded, waiting. I had been waiting too, for considerably longer. Rachel read the first sentence of page 4 aloud, and then she paused, and then she looked up, not at Stephanie, not at Marcus Webb, not at David. She looked at me, and she handed it to me. I had run Brennan Construction for 40 years. That is not a thing I say often, because men who say it often are usually the kind who need other people to know it. I mention it here only because it explains something about how I came to be sitting in that conference room on a Thursday afternoon in March, watching my daughter-in-law's smile hold itself in place like a structure that had lost its load-bearing wall. 40 years of building things in Portland means 40 years of reading people before they read you. It means knowing the difference between a man who is nervous because the job is hard and a man who is nervous because he knows something you don't. It means watching hands, watching eyes, watching what people do with their coffee cups when they think no one is looking. I started Brennan Construction in 1984 with a used F-150, a commercial license, and a line of credit I had no business asking for. By the time David was born, we had 12 employees and a contract with the city for 2 pedestrian bridges over the Willamette. By the time he graduated from the University of Oregon with his architecture degree, we had 63 employees, 4 active municipal contracts, and a reputation in the Pacific Northwest that I had spent those 40 years building one project at a time. I am not a wealthy man by the standards of people who measure wealth in jets and vacation homes, but I am a man who built something real, and I know what real looks like, and I know what it doesn't, My son David is an architect. He is 36 years old, and he is genuinely talented, the kind of talented that is quiet about itself, that shows up in the way a room feels when you walk into it, rather than in anything he says at dinner parties. He joined Brennan Construction 8 years ago as lead designer, and in those 8 years, He has brought in 3 projects I would never have won without him. I don't tell him that enough. That is its own subject, and I will come back to it. He married Stephanie Mitchell 4 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard outside McMinnville. It was a beautiful day. I remember the light on the hillside and my wife Margaret's chair. She had been gone for 6 years by then, and David had asked if we should put a photograph on the table at her seat, and I had said yes without thinking twice. Stephanie had suggested, gently, that it might make the day feel heavy. David had looked at me. I had said it was fine either way. The photograph did not appear at the ceremony. I noted that. I noted it the way I note things without saying anything, without changing my face, the way you note a hairline crack in a foundation that isn't yet structural, but that you know you'll be coming back to. Stephanie works in marketing at a technology firm in the Pearl District. She is good at her job. From what I understand, she speaks about campaigns and brand positioning with the fluency of someone who has genuinely mastered a language. In the first year of her marriage to David, I found her charming. She was attentive at family dinners. She asked about the business with what seemed like real curiosity. She laughed at things I said, which I am not above admitting I noticed and appreciated. What I also noticed, more slowly, was the spending. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who wasn't paying attention. A renovation to the kitchen in their house on Thurman Street that David mentioned cost $40,000 more than the original estimate. A trip to Italy that David said had been a surprise gift from Stephanie, which he told me about with the particular smile of a man who is not entirely sure he is allowed to be concerned. Membership at a club downtown that neither of them, as far as I could tell, actually used with any regularity. These things accumulate the way water accumulates behind a retaining wall, invisibly, steadily, until one day the pressure is structural. David called me on a Wednesday evening in early February. I was in the office on Burnside, reviewing bid documents for a drainage project in Beaverton. He said he needed to meet, that there were some things he and Stephanie were working through, and that Stephanie had suggested it might help to involve a lawyer to formalize some agreements. He said it the way he says things he is not sure about quickly, with a slight rise at the end of the sentence that is not quite a question, but is asking for one. I asked him what kind of agreements. He said financial, property, some things related to the business. I asked him if everything was all right between them. He said yes. He said Stephanie just wanted to make sure everything was clearly documented. He said she had mentioned getting her own attorney, someone separate from whoever I might use, just to make sure all the interests were properly represented. He said this last part carefully, as though he had rehearsed it, or as though someone had suggested the phrasing to him. I held the phone and looked at the bid documents on my desk. There was a line item for soil stabilization that I had been meaning to question. I set it aside. I told David I would be there. What I did not tell David, what I have never told David, because there are things a father knows that a son needs to discover for himself, and the timing of that discovery matters more than the knowledge itself, was that the phrase, her own attorney, had landed in me the way a level lands on a surface that looks flat but isn't. Stephanie had been married to my son for 4 years. They had a house, a shared income, a life that was, by every visible measure, functional. People who are working through things, as David had put it, do not typically begin by ensuring that their legal representation is separate. People who are planning something do. I drove home that evening on the Burnside Bridge. The river was low for February, gray-green and moving fast from the rain earlier in the week. I have driven that bridge more times than I could count to the office. From the office to the hospital the night Margaret died, back from the hospital that same night alone. It is the kind of route that stops registering as a choice and becomes something closer to a reflex. But that evening I noticed it. The water, the light going out of the sky, the way the city looked from the middle of the bridge like something that had been built carefully and was still, despite everything, standing. I thought about my son. I thought about the way he had said Stephanie's name on the phone, not with the ease of a man who says his wife's name 100 times a day, but with a slight, almost imperceptible care as though he were carrying something fragile and was not entirely certain of his grip. I did not sleep well that night. I made coffee at 5:30 in the morning, and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what it means to protect someone without taking away their ability to protect themselves. I have been thinking about that question for 36 years. I have not yet arrived at a satisfying answer. But I called Rachel Chen's office when it opened at 8, and I made an appointment for that Friday, and I did not mention it to David. The first thing I noticed about Stephanie's management of their household was how reasonable it all sounded. She brought it up at dinner a Sunday in early November, the three of us at the table, in their apartment on Burnside, the kind of meal where she'd made everything from scratch and the kitchen smelled like rosemary and browned butter. She was explaining to David that she'd been looking at their accounts and thought it would make sense to consolidate. One joint account for everything. Simpler, she said. Less back and forth between two banks. David nodded and said that made sense. He said, "Whatever you think." She smiled and passed me the bread. I said nothing. I tore the bread and I ate it, and I thought that is a very small transfer of authority, and it is dressed very neatly in the language of convenience. Over the following weeks, I watched it extend. She handled the credit card statements. She paid the utilities. She set up auto payments on David's student loans, the ones he'd nearly finished paying down before they married, and told him not to worry about it. She had a system. David told me this on the phone one Thursday evening, and he said it with relief, the way a man talks about setting down something heavy. He said Stephanie was good at this kind of thing. He said he was lucky. I asked him if he'd looked at the new account setup. He said he trusted her to handle it. I said, "That's good." I did not say anything else. The distance came more slowly, and it came wrapped in the same practical language. By February, when I'd call David on a Saturday afternoon, he would pick up sounding slightly distracted, and then I would hear Stephanie's voice in the background, not her words, just the tone of it, a kind of conversational gravity, and David would say, "Hey, Dad, can I call you back? We're just in the middle of something." He always called back, but it was always shorter. And when I drove up to Portland from my office in Tigard to take him to lunch, twice in the spring, he had to cancel within an hour of us meeting. Once because of a showing Stephanie had scheduled. Once because she'd made plans he hadn't known about. He apologized both times. He sounded genuinely sorry. The third time, he didn't cancel. He arrived at the diner on Hawthorne 20 minutes late, and he sat down and ordered coffee and then said, almost before I could speak, "Steph wanted me to say she hopes you're not upset about the rescheduling. She knows you're busy with the Clackamas project, and she didn't want to add to your plate." I looked at him. The Clackamas project had been finished for 6 weeks. I'd mentioned it in passing once, in October. I said, "I'm not busy." David said, "Right, of course." He stirred his coffee. I noticed he stirred it long after it had been mixed. That was the first time I heard the debt language. He said, toward the end of that lunch, that Stephanie had mentioned something about the wedding, specifically, about the reception venue, the Multnomah Athletic Club, which I had paid for without being asked because it was what David wanted, and David's mother would have wanted to see him married somewhere beautiful. Stephanie had apparently told David that the cost of the venue had put them in a difficult position, that it had shifted the financial balance of their first year in a way that was still affecting them. David said this carefully. He was not accusing me of anything. He was repeating something he had heard, and he was watching my face while he repeated it to see what I would do with it. "I paid for our lunch," I said. "Tell Stephanie I hope the rosemary chicken turned out well last Sunday." He blinked. He said it had. I left a 20% tip, and I drove back to Tigard, and I called my accountant and asked her to pull the invoice from the Multnomah Athletic Club from 18 months ago. She emailed it to me that afternoon. I filed it in the folder I had started keeping in my desk drawer, the one with the green tab. The folder was not a plan. I want to be precise about that. It was an instinct, the same instinct I developed over 30 years of running a construction company, of watching contracts and watching people, and learning that the gap between what someone says and what they mean is almost always visible if you look at the right things. I was not building a case. I was watching my son. The dinner table was where it was most visible. We had Sunday dinners at their apartment every 3 or 4 weeks, and I noticed slowly, and then all at once, the way you notice a room has gotten dark, that Stephanie always sat between David and me. Not across from him, between us. She would ask David a question just as I was finishing a sentence, and David would turn toward her, and the conversation would shift. It was not aggressive. It was smooth. I would be talking about the East Side Development Project or asking David about his work on the Morrison Bridge Commission, and then Stephanie would say something like, "Oh, Dave, did you tell your dad about the Selwood kitchen?" And David would pivot, and the conversation would go somewhere else entirely. I began testing it. I would ask David a direct question, something technical about his work, something only he could answer, and I would watch how long it took before Stephanie entered the exchange. The average was 40 seconds, sometimes less. Once, when I asked David if he'd had a chance to look at the revised load calculations for a residential project he was consulting on for my company, Stephanie said, before David could answer, "He's been so swamped, Tom. The new firm is really running them hard." David nodded. He had not been given the opportunity to answer for himself. I did not say anything. I finished my wine, and I asked about the dessert, and I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I thought about my son at 6 years old, building things out of wooden blocks on the living room floor, and how he used to narrate everything he was doing. "This is the wall. This is the door. This is where the family lives," as though he needed a witness to make the construction real. He had always needed someone to tell things to. I had always been that person. I was watching Stephanie become that person instead, and I was watching it happen through 100 small adjustments, each one invisible on its own, each one logical, each one dressed in the language of simplicity and care, and not wanting to be a burden. That was the particular genius of it. She was not taking. She was offering. She was offering to handle things, to simplify things, to manage things, to stand between David and the difficulty of the world, including, it seemed, the difficulty of his father. By April, David had not been to my office in 4 months. This was unusual. He had a habit, since he was young, of stopping by when he was in Tegard for site visits, not for any reason, just to sit in the chair across from my desk for 20 minutes and talk. He'd done it even when he was in graduate school, even when he was busy. He had not done it since December. I noticed. I did not call attention to it. I added a note to the green folder, and I went back to work, and I waited. I have spent a long time learning how to wait. It is not a comfortable skill. It is not the same as patience, which is something gentle. Waiting, the way I mean it, is a form of attention sustained and quiet and very still. The way you stand at the edge of a construction site before the crews arrive, reading the ground, reading the grade, reading what the land is telling you before you commit the first load-bearing decision. You do not act until you understand what you are standing on. I was standing on something I did not yet fully understand, but I was beginning to read the grade. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was at the office on Morrison Street, the same building I'd owned for 22 years, the one with the cracked lintel above the third-floor window that my crew had repaired twice and that I kept meaning to replace entirely. I was reviewing a subcontractor invoice when my cell phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gerald Marsh. He said he was a private banker at Cascade Trust, the branch on Southwest Broadway. He said he knew me because I'd been a client there for 16 years and because his predecessor, a woman named Louise Hartley, had handled my business accounts until she retired. He said he was calling because he wasn't sure he should be calling, but that Louise had always told him that if something felt wrong, it was better to make the call and be wrong than to stay quiet and be right. I set down the invoice. Gerald told me that a woman had come into the branch 3 days earlier asking general questions not about my accounts specifically, he was careful to say, but about the process of asset protection in the context of a marital dissolution. She had asked about how jointly held business interests were typically evaluated in Oregon divorce proceedings. She had asked whether a business owner's personal assets could be shielded from a spouse's claim if the business predated the marriage. She had not given her name, But she had mentioned, in passing, that her husband worked for a construction firm in Portland and that his father owned it. Gerald said he hadn't thought much of it at the time. People asked questions. But then he'd seen the name Brennan on a new account inquiry the following day, a personal savings account opened in a single name, and something hadn't sat right with him. He said he hoped he was wasting my time. I told him he wasn't. After I hung up, I sat for a while with my hands flat on the desk. The invoice was still there. I didn't look at it. Outside, a truck was backing up on Morrison Street, and the beeping came through the window in slow, even intervals. I counted 7 of them before it stopped. That afternoon, I drove to David's office. He shared a studio space with 2 other architects on the 6th floor of a building near the Pearl District, a good address. The kind of address Stephanie had encouraged him to choose when he left the larger firm 2 years ago. I had thought at the time that it was more space than he needed. I had not said so. David was at his drafting table when I came in. He looked up and smiled the way he always did when I appeared without calling ahead, a little surprised, a little pleased, the way he'd looked as a boy when I came home early from a job site. I asked if he had a few minutes. He said, of course. I did not tell him about Gerald Marsh. I told him instead that I'd been thinking about the business succession documents, that I wanted to make sure everything was in order, that it was something I should have addressed sooner. I asked him, as naturally as I could manage, whether he and Stephanie had ever talked about financial planning, whether they'd done anything formal, a prenuptial agreement, maybe, or any kind of asset documentation. David leaned back in his chair. He said yes. Actually, they'd done a prenup before the wedding. He said Stephanie had suggested it. He said she'd told him it was just being responsible, that it protected both of them, that her friend from college had gone through a difficult divorce, and it had made Stephanie want to be prepared. I asked if he'd read it carefully before he signed. He looked at me the way adult children look at their parents when they think the question is slightly insulting. He said he'd read it. He said their attorneys had reviewed it. He said Stephanie just wanted to be practical. I nodded. I told him that was good. I told him I was glad they'd been thorough. I drove back to Morrison Street, and I sat at my desk until the office was empty and the building was quiet. Something wasn't right. I had known it in the way. You know a foundation is compromised before you see the crack, a shift in how the floor feels underfoot, a door that no longer closes flush. Stephanie had asked a banker about divorce proceedings. She had framed it as general curiosity. She had suggested the prenup herself and told David it was to protect them both. I needed to know what was in that document. I called Rachel Chen at 7:15 that evening. She answered on the second ring. I had known Rachel for 11 years. She had handled 3 contract disputes for Brennan Construction and 1 estate matter after my wife died, and she was the kind of attorney who did not waste words or time. I told her I had a situation. I told her I wasn't sure yet what kind. I told her I needed her to help me understand what I was looking at before I decided what to do about it. She said she could see me Thursday morning. I said Thursday would be fine. David kept his home office on the ground floor of the house he and Stephanie had bought 3 years ago in the Irvington neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow with original fir floors and a detached garage they'd converted into a studio. I had helped him negotiate the price. The office was a small room off the hallway, lined with bookshelves he'd built himself during the first winter they lived there. He'd always been good with his hands, even as a boy. He'd learned that from me, and from watching the crews on my job sites when he was 12, 13 years old. David had given me a spare key 2 years earlier, after a water heater failure left him stranded in Seattle during a project review, and he needed someone to let the plumber in. He'd never asked for it back. I had never used it without telling him until that Wednesday morning when he was at his firm's office across town and Stephanie was at a client presentation in Seattle. I let myself in at 9:45. The house was quiet. It smelled like coffee that had been left on too long and something floral, a candle or a diffuser, something Stephanie had added after they moved in. David's office smelled different from the rest of the house. It smelled like paper and drafting pencils and the cedar oil he used on his drawing board. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking for. I knew the prenup existed. David had mentioned it once, briefly. About 6 weeks before the wedding, in the way people mention things they consider settled and unimportant, he'd said Stephanie had suggested it, that their attorney had drawn it up, that it was standard. He used that word, standard. I had asked him if he'd read it carefully. He said he had. I didn't ask again. The filing cabinet in the corner was unlocked. David had never been secretive about documents he trusted people, which was one of his better qualities and occasionally one of his more dangerous ones. The top drawer held project files, permit applications, correspondence with his firm's clients. The second drawer held household records, insurance policies, the mortgage, utility accounts, vehicle titles. I found the prenup in a flat archival box on the lower shelf beneath his drafting table, not in the cabinet at all. The box was labeled in David's handwriting neat block letters, the way he'd always written since architecture school trained the habit into him. It said, legal personal. There were 4 documents inside. I recognized the property deed, the will he'd had drawn up after they married, and a copy of their joint account agreement. The 4th was a document bound with a binder clip, 17 pages printed on legal weight paper. I sat down in David's chair and read it. Pages 1 through 3 were, as David had said, standard, asset disclosure, definitions of separate and marital property, a clause about spousal support waiver if the marriage ended after fewer than 5 years. The language was precise and unremarkable, the kind of prenuptial agreement a competent attorney drafts in an afternoon. I had seen enough contracts in 40 years of business to read one without needing someone to explain it to me. Page 4 was different. The clause began mid-paragraph, formatted as a continuation of the section on asset division, easy to miss if you were reading quickly or if you trusted the person who had handed you the document. The heading above it said simply, Section 7, Additional Provisions, and the language that followed was dense, technical, and deliberate. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. In the event that David Matthew Brennan initiates or pursues dissolution of the marriage, he agrees to transfer to Stephanie Ann Mitchell 80% of all assets held in his name at the time of filing, including but not limited to investment accounts, real property, business interests, and any assets received as inheritance, gift, or transfer from immediate family members within the preceding 10 years. I set the document down on the drafting table. The preceding 10 years. That phrase had been placed there with care. It wasn't accidental. The Brennan construction shares I had transferred to David 4 years ago, a partial ownership stake I'd given him on his 32nd birthday because he had earned it and because I wanted him to have something real, something that would be his regardless of what happened to the company. Those shares fell within that window. The trust account my wife had established for David before she died, funded with the proceeds of her life insurance policy, fell within that window. Everything I had ever given my son, everything his mother had left him, was captured in that single clause. Stephanie had not written this paragraph carelessly. She had written it, or had it written, knowing exactly what it covered. She knew about the shares. She had been present when I gave them to David. She had smiled and said it was a wonderful gift. She knew about the trust. David had told her, early in their relationship, the way people in love tell each other everything before they understand what that means. She had known, before she ever signed this document, that she would use it. I don't know how long I sat there. The light through the office window shifted a cloud moving, probably the kind of gray October morning Portland produces without effort. I became aware that I was holding the document with both hands, and that my hands were completely still. I took my phone from my jacket pocket and photographed page 4. I photographed it 3 times, from 2 different angles, making sure the text was fully legible in each image. Then I photographed the signature page, at the back, David's signature, Stephanie's signature, and the notarization stamp from an attorney named Gerald Foss, whose office address was listed as a building on Southwest Broadway that I recognized as being 3 blocks from Stephanie's former marketing firm. Gerald Foss had not been David's attorney. I knew who David's attorney had been at the time, a man named Carter, whom David had used for 2 years before switching firms. David had mentioned using Carter for the prenup, But the notarization on this document did not belong to Carter's office. It belonged to an attorney who worked 3 blocks from where Stephanie had spent her weekdays for 4 years before the wedding. I put the prenup back in the archival box exactly as I had found it. I replaced the box on the shelf beneath the drafting table. I stood up, straightened the chair, and walked back through the hallway to the front door. Outside, the air was cold and smelled like rain coming in from the coast. I stood on David's porch for a moment and looked at the street. The maple in the front yard had gone orange, and 2 of the leaves had come down overnight and were sitting on the porch steps. I called Rachel Chen at 10:12. She answered before the second ring. I said, "I have the document. I need you to look at page 4. She didn't ask how I'd obtained it. Rachel Chen had been a lawyer for 23 years, and she understood that some questions were better saved for the right moment. She said, "Can you be here at 2? I told her I could. I walked to my truck and drove across the city with the photographs on my phone and the name Gerald Foss somewhere in the back of my mind, sitting there quietly, the way a nail sits in a board after you've driven it in flush with the surface, not going anywhere. Rachel Chen's office was on the 11th floor of a building on Southwest Morrison, 12 minutes from my office, and 23 years of her practice concentrated into a space that smelled like paper and something faintly herbal tea, I thought, or maybe just the particular smell of a room where difficult things were said calmly and often. She had a corner window that looked out over the West Hills. I had never once seen her look at it during a meeting. She was at her desk when I arrived. The document was already on the table between us. I had sent the photographs from my phone that morning, and she had printed them out and arranged them in order. Page 4 was on top, separated from the others by a small yellow tab she had placed there herself. She didn't stand when I came in. She just said, "Sit down, Tom." I sat. She picked up page 4 and read it again. I watched her face. Rachel Chen had a face that gave very little away under ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances, and still she gave very little away. But I had known her for 9 years, since she handled the contract dispute on the Morrison Bridge project, and I knew the difference between her reading something for the first time and reading something she had already read and was deciding how to say. She set the page down. "This clause," she said, touching the 3rd paragraph from the bottom with one finger, "is not standard. I want you to understand that. Prenuptial agreements vary. They can be aggressive. They can favor one party significantly, and that alone doesn't make them fraudulent. Courts see aggressive prenups regularly." She paused. "This is not aggressive. This is a trap." I didn't say anything. If David signed this and the signature on page 6 suggests he did, then, in the event of a divorce initiated by either party, every asset David holds is subject to forfeiture. Not split, not negotiated, forfeited. That includes anything he earned before the marriage, anything gifted to him, and anything he might inherit. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses, including anything from you. I had already understood this when I read it myself, standing in David's study at 7 in the morning with the light coming through the blinds. But hearing Rachel say it aloud in that room, in that flat and precise voice, made it land differently. It made it real in a way that the page itself had not quite managed. "She didn't write this the week before the wedding," Rachel said. "The language here, the specificity of the asset categories, the forfeiture structure, the timeline clauses, this took time. This was drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they wanted." She turned the page slightly so I could see it from across the desk. Page 4 tells me that Stephanie Mitchell did not enter this marriage with the intention of building something. She entered it with the intention of being positioned to take something. That is premeditated. Tom, that is the word I would use in court. I said, "Can you prove that David didn't understand what he was signing?" "Potentially. The language on page 4 is embedded in a section that reads, on the surface, like a standard asset disclosure clause. If David's attorney at the time, and I'll need to know who that was, did not specifically walk him through this paragraph, we have grounds to argue that he signed without full comprehension of the terms. That is coercion by omission. She picked up her pen and made a note. It's also possible that the prenup was presented to him under time pressure, a week before the wedding, 2 days before those circumstances matter. He told me he signed it the night before the ceremony. Rachel wrote something else. She didn't react to that with her face, but she wrote it down with the kind of deliberateness that told me she considered it significant. If Stephanie ever uses this document to make a demand, she said, setting the pen down, we will have evidence that she prepared this plan long before any marital dispute arose. That changes the legal character of what she's doing. It's no longer a divorce proceeding. It becomes fraud. I looked at the window. The West Hills were gray with morning cloud. I thought about David at 36, sitting at a drafting table at 11 at night, the way he used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework. And I thought about the fact that I had not been in the room when he signed that document, and that I could not have been, and that this was the particular helplessness of being someone's father. I said, I'm not going to tell him what I found. Rachel looked at me. Not yet, I said. I want him to see it himself. If I hand him this, it's my word against hers. He'll defend her. That's what he does. I paused. But if she uses it, if she makes a move, I need to be ready to put it in front of him in a way he can't argue with. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if she brings this into a formal proceeding, we will be there. And when she does, the document she thinks is her leverage becomes the evidence of her own premeditation. She closed the folder. I'll prepare a response brief. We'll be ready. I stood up. I picked up my copy of page 4 and folded it once along its original crease. Rachel said, Tom, whatever happens, you didn't do anything wrong by finding this. I told her I knew that. I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked to my truck in the parking structure on 10th. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The city moved around me the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, entirely unaware. I thought about David. I thought about the night before his wedding, when he had called me from the hotel and said he was nervous, and I had told him that was normal, and he had laughed and said he wasn't nervous about the wedding, just about being good enough at it. I had told him that the fact that he was asking the question was already most of the answer. I started the engine and pulled out onto 10th. The call came on a Thursday evening, 3 days after my meeting with Rachel. David's voice on the phone was careful in the way it gets when he's trying to sound like nothing is wrong. He said Stephanie had organized a family dinner for Sunday. Her parents were coming up from Eugene. He wanted me there. I asked if this was a social dinner. He paused. She wants to talk through some things. As a family. I said I would be there. I already knew what it was. Rachel had warned me that Stephanie's attorney, Marcus Webb, had filed a preliminary motion that same week, a procedural move. She said, designed to establish a timeline. The dinner was not about family. It was about witnesses. Stephanie's parents, Gerald and Norma Mitchell, were already seated when I arrived at the house on Glisson Street. Gerald was a retired insurance adjuster from Eugene who laughed at his own jokes before finishing them. Norma kept a tight smile the way some people keep a spare key visible, but not warm. 2 of Stephanie's friends were also there, a woman named Cassie, who worked with her at the agency, and Cassie's husband, whose name I didn't catch and didn't need to. 6 people at the table before David and I sat down. 6 witnesses. David met me at the door. He looked like he hadn't slept well. He shook my hand the way he used to when he was 12 and trying to seem older than he was. I followed him inside. Stephanie had set the table carefully. Good dishes. The ones from the cabinet she kept locked the rest of the year. Candles. A bottle of wine already open. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she was glad I could make it. I told her the drive was easy. We sat down. The dinner itself lasted about 40 minutes. Gerald told a story about a fishing trip. Norma asked David about a project he was working on, a mixed-use development in the Pearl District, and David talked about it with the particular enthusiasm he has when architecture is the subject, which is the only time I've seen him completely forget to be careful. Cassie and her husband spoke mostly to each other. I ate the salmon Stephanie had prepared and watched the table the way I used to watch job sites looking for the thing that was about to shift. It shifted when Stephanie set down her fork. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The table went quiet the way rooms do when someone with a prepared speech begins to deliver it. She looked at David and said, "I need to say something, and I need everyone here to hear it." David looked up from his plate. "You have humiliated me," she said. "In front of your colleagues, in front of my friends, in front of your father. You have made me feel like I don't matter in this marriage, and I have been patient. David, I have been more patient than you deserve." She paused. Her hands were flat on the table. "So I'm giving you a choice. Right now, in front of your family and mine, you apologize to me genuinely, publicly, or we are done, tonight." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Gerald cleared his throat. Norma's tight smile had not moved. Cassie was watching Stephanie with an expression that suggested she had known this was coming. Her husband was studying the centerpiece. David said quietly, "Stephanie, I'm not finished." She reached down beside her chair and placed a manila envelope on the table. I recognized the format. Marcus Webb's firm used that particular weight of envelope. "My attorney has prepared the documents. If you choose not to apologize, you sign these tonight. And I want you to understand what that means. You sign away everything. The equity in this house, your interest in the Cascade project, everything we have built together. David goes to me. That is what the prenuptial agreement provides for. That is what you agreed to." She sat back. She had delivered it exactly as she had planned it. I could see that in the way her shoulders settled, the small release of someone who has finished a prepared thing. David was looking at the envelope. His face was very still. I had not moved since she began speaking. I was sitting at the far end of the table, and I had counted, without meaning to, 7 seconds of silence before David finally looked at me. I gave him one small nod. Not encouragement, not instruction, just the signal we had worked out without ever discussing it, the one that meant don't answer yet. Ask to see what's in front of you. David turned back to Stephanie. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I want to see the documents," he said. "Before I do anything, I want to read what I'm signing." Stephanie's expression shifted barely, but I saw it. Something behind her eyes recalculated. "That's not necessary," she said. "Your attorney can review them after—" "I want to read them now." He looked at the envelope on the table. "If you're asking me to sign something tonight, I'm going to read it first." Gerald made a sound that was almost a word. Norma's smile had finally, slightly, changed. Stephanie reached for the envelope. Her hand stopped halfway. I picked up my water glass and drank from it. The room was very quiet. Outside, on Gleason Street, a car passed and its headlights moved across the wall and disappeared. David's hand was on the table, flat and open, waiting. He hadn't touched the envelope. He hadn't looked at me. He was looking at Stephanie, and she was looking at the envelope, and the envelope was sitting exactly where Marcus Webb had placed it 40 minutes ago when he'd arranged his documents with the kind of deliberate precision that I recognized the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times. I said, "I called my attorney this afternoon." Stephanie looked up. "Rachel Chen is waiting in the lobby," I said. "I asked her to join us." Marcus Webb set down his pen. It was a small movement, but it was the first time since we'd sat down that he'd put the pen down completely. David turned to look at me. I couldn't read his expression fully. There was something in it that wasn't quite surprise. More like a man who has been walking through fog and has just felt solid ground beneath one foot. I said, "David, would you like me to ask her to come in?" He said, "Yes." I stood and walked to the door. Rachel was in the lobby, standing near the window that looked out over the parking structure. She was wearing her gray wool coat and carrying a single folder, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has been in many rooms like this one and has learned that stillness is its own form of preparation. She had been in family law for 23 years. I had worked with her twice before, once when my wife's estate was settled, and once when a subcontractor tried to renegotiate a signed contract 3 days before completion. Both times, she had been the calmest person in the building. She followed me back into the conference room without speaking. I said, This is Rachel Chen. She represents me." Marcus Webb looked at her the way attorneys look at each other, a quick professional assessment, a recalibration. He said, "I wasn't informed there would be additional counsel present." Rachel said, "You weren't required to be?" She set her folder on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down. She did not open the folder yet. Gerald shifted in his seat. Norma had both hands in her lap now. Stephanie said, "This is completely unnecessary. The documents are straightforward, and we were in the middle of—" "Rachel," I said, "would you please read page 4 of the prenuptial agreement?" The room went still in a way that was different from the previous silences. The previous silences had been waiting, silences the kind that precede an expected event. This was something else. Rachel reached into her folder and removed a document. Not the envelope on the table, her own copy. She had printed it from the file I'd brought to her office 4 days ago. She turned to page 4 without searching for it. She'd read it before. She placed the document flat on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then she read. "Wiction 4.1, she said. Her voice was level and unhurried. In the event of dissolution of marriage, the party of the first part, identified as David Brennan, agrees to relinquish 80% of all marital and premarital assets, including, but not limited to, real property held individually or jointly, business interests, inheritance, and gifts received from family members prior to or during the marriage." She stopped. David said, "Read that again." She read it again. The second time was quieter than the first. Not because Rachel's voice changed, it didn't, but because the room absorbed it differently. The first reading had been information. The second was comprehension. Stephanie said, "That clause is standard in complex asset situations. Marcus explained it to both of us before we signed." David looked at her. 80%, he said, "including inheritance, including gifts from family." "It's protective language." Protective of what? His voice was still even. That surprised me. I had expected something louder, but David had always been more precise than loud. He was an architect by training and by temperament, a man who looked at structures and asked whether they would hold. He was asking that question now. Marcus Webb said, "The clause is legally standard in prenuptial agreements where one party has substantially greater premarital assets." "My father's company," David said. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at the document in Rachel's hands, the property on Cascade, the equity in Brennan Construction. He looked at Stephanie. "Those are the assets this refers to." Stephanie said, "David, I need you to calm down." He hadn't raised his voice. He was perfectly calm. I thought she's used that phrase before, in other situations, to redirect him. It had probably worked before. It did not work now. Rachel said, "There's a second element on page 4 I should read." Stephanie's attorney put his hand flat on the table. "I'd like to review what you're working from before any further." "You're welcome to follow along," Rachel said. She turned the document slightly so it faced Marcus Webb across the table. Section 4.3. The provisions of Section 4.1 shall apply in full, regardless of the duration of the marriage, and shall not be subject to modification, mediation, or judicial review, as both parties have waived their rights to independent legal counsel review of this document. Gerald said, "Lord." It was the first thing he'd said in 20 minutes. He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, and then he looked at his wife. And Norma looked back at him with an expression I recognized, the expression of people who have just understood something they wished they hadn't. Marcus Webb was reading his own copy. His finger moved down the page slowly and then stopped. Rachel said, "The waiver of independent legal counsel review is the operative element. It suggests that the party who drafted this document or directed its drafting intended to limit the other party's ability to fully understand what they were signing." "That's a characterization," Marcus said, "not a legal finding." "It's an observation," Rachel said. "The finding comes later." Stephanie had not spoken for nearly 2 minutes. She was looking at the table. Her hands were in her lap, below the table's edge, and I could not see them. But I could see her shoulders, and they had changed the particular stillness of someone who has stopped calculating next moves and is simply waiting to see what comes. Her two friends, Amber and Christine, who had come to provide what I imagined Stephanie had expected to be witnessing of her victory, were looking at her now with the particular attention of people who have just revised a story they thought they understood. Amber had not touched her wine glass in several minutes. Christine was looking at the prenuptial agreement on the table the way you look at something you've walked past many times without examining. David said, "When was this drafted?" Rachel said, "The document is dated 14 months before the marriage. The drafting attorney's name is in the footer." "That's not Marcus's firm," David said. He had looked at the footer himself. "No," Rachel said, "it's not." David set both hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Stephanie. She met his eyes, whatever she had prepared to say, and I believed she had prepared something, because she had prepared everything else she did not say it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, and then she looked away. I had not spoken in several minutes. I picked up my water glass. It was empty. I set it back down. Outside on Gleason Street, another car passed. Its headlights crossed the ceiling this time, a slow arc from one wall to the other, and then it was gone. Rachel let the silence run. I had seen her do this before in the conference room on the 14th floor 3 weeks ago, when she first showed me what she had found. She understood that silence, at certain moments, does more work than any sentence she could construct. Marcus Webb had not learned that. He was already leaning forward, already opening his mouth. "The footer is a clerical error," Marcus said. "Firms merge. Letterheads get updated. This proves nothing about the document's validity." Rachel looked at him the way a structural engineer looks at a load-bearing wall that someone has just suggested removing. Patient, certain. She opened the folder to the next tabbed section and placed 3 pages on the table. "I requested the drafting history from the document management system of the firm that prepared this prenuptial agreement," she said. "This is the metadata log. It shows every edit, every addition, and the timestamp for each one." She pointed to the second page. "David Brennan signed the prenuptial agreement on March 15th, 2020, 3 weeks before the wedding." David was looking at the pages. He had pulled them toward him without being asked. "Page 4, Rachel continued, was added to the document on March 12th, 2020, 3 days before David signed." The room was very quiet. "I have the correspondence to confirm it. Stephanie Mitchell, she was still using her maiden name professionally, at that point contacted the drafting attorney by email on March 10th and requested an amendment. The amendment was page 4. The drafting attorney added it, generated a clean copy of the full document, and sent it to both parties for signature." Rachel paused. The cover email to David described the updated document as a minor formatting revision. Marcus said, "That's—" "I have the email," Rachel said. She placed it on the table. A single printed page, the kind that looks unremarkable until you read it. The subject line reads, "Updated prenup formatting only." The body says, "Please review and sign at your convenience. No substantive changes from the version you reviewed." Those are the exact words. David read the email. He read it twice. I could see his jaw working slightly, the way it had when he was 11 years old and trying not to cry after he fell off a roof we were framing, not from pain, but from the effort of understanding something that didn't make sense yet. He looked up at Stephanie. She had both hands in her lap. Whatever composure she had maintained through the reading of page 4, through Marcus's objections, through David's silence, it was thinner now. I could see the effort it was taking. "David," I said. It was the first time I had spoken in several minutes. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "When you signed the prenup, did you read page 4? He looked at me. Then he looked back at the email on the table. "No," he said. "Stephanie told me it was standard. She said her lawyer had already gone through everything, and that it was the same version we'd both reviewed." He stopped. "She said it was just the standard language." I nodded. I did not say anything else. "This constitutes contract fraud," Rachel said. She said it without drama, the way she would state a square footage or a zoning classification. A material amendment was made to a legal document after the other party had completed their review, and that amendment was deliberately concealed through a false description in the transmittal correspondence. David's signature was obtained under a misrepresentation of the document's contents. Under Oregon contract law, this is sufficient grounds to void the prenuptial agreement in its entirety. Marcus had his pen in his hand, but he wasn't writing anything. He was looking at the email. "I want to note," Rachel said, turning to Marcus directly, "that I am not asserting your firm had any knowledge of this. The drafting attorney prepared what your client requested and sent what your client instructed. The misrepresentation originated with the instruction, not the drafting." She said it evenly. It was not a courtesy, it was a precise statement, and Marcus understood the precision of it. It meant that the liability sat exactly where it sat, and not 1 inch to either side. Stephanie said, "That's not," and then stopped. David turned to look at her. He turned slowly, the way you turn when you already know what you're going to see. "Stephanie," he said, just her name. She said, "I was protecting us. The language in page 4 was protective. It was meant to protect both of us from your fathers." She stopped again. She looked at me for the first time in several minutes. "From outside interference." I let her look. I did not respond. "It protected you," David said. He was not raising his voice. That was the thing I noticed, how steady he sounded. Steadier than I expected. Steadier perhaps than I would have sounded at 36 if I had just read what he had just read. It didn't protect us. There is no us in page 4. I read it. Rachel read it to the room. My name is in it 3 times, and every time it's in a clause that takes something away from me. Stephanie said, "David, if you'd just let me explain the context." "The context," Rachel said quietly, "is in the metadata log. The context is March 10th, March 12th, and March 15th. The context is the email with the subject line that says, 'Formatting only.'" She gathered the pages back into the folder with the same unhurried movements she had used throughout. "I don't think there's additional context that changes those dates." Marcus put his pen down. He had not written anything. I looked at the empty water glass in front of me. Someone had refilled it at some point I hadn't noticed when. I picked it up and took a drink and set it back down. The overhead light in the conference room had a slight flicker I had been aware of since we sat down. It flickered twice now in quick succession and then steadied. David was still looking at Stephanie. She was looking at the table. Rachel closed the folder. She placed her hand flat on top of it. "The prenuptial agreement," she said, "is void." Stephanie moved first. She pushed back from the table not dramatically, just a few inches, as if she needed the distance between herself and Rachel's folder. "That's an old draft," she said. "That page 4, I don't even know how it ended up in the final document. We went through multiple versions. Marcus, tell them." Marcus Webb had picked his pen back up. He was clicking it now, slowly, without appearing to notice he was doing it. He said, "Stephanie, I would advise you to—" "It's a draft," she said again. Her voice was steady. That was the thing I noticed, how steady it was. Not the steadiness of someone telling the truth. The steadiness of someone who had rehearsed for the version of this moment where the explanation would be enough. I signed a completely different version, whatever that page says. It wasn't in the document I agreed to. Rachel opened the folder again. She did not look at Stephanie. She turned to the 3rd tab and removed a single printed page, a screenshot. 2 emails printed side by side, timestamps visible at the top. "This is an email exchange," Rachel said, "between your attorney's office and the firm that prepared the prenuptial agreement, dated 11 days before the document was executed. The subject line is Final Language, page 4. The body of the email reads, 'Please confirm the inclusion of the asset reversion clause as discussed. Client has approved the final wording.'" Rachel set the page on the table and slid it toward the center. "The reply confirms receipt and inclusion." Stephanie looked at the page. Then she looked at Marcus. Marcus stopped clicking his pen. David had not moved. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table, The way I had seen him sit at his drafting table when a calculation wasn't adding up very still, working through something he didn't want to be working through. "Stephanie," he said. His voice was quiet. "You told me page 4 was just the standard disclosure section. You told me it was boilerplate." She didn't answer immediately. In the silence, I heard the overhead light flicker again, one short pulse. 2 of Stephanie's friends were still in the room. A woman named Kara, who worked in her department, had been standing near the door since Rachel began reading. A man named Joel, who I had met once at David and Stephanie's apartment, was seated along the wall to my left. Kara picked up her coat from the back of the chair she had been leaning against. She folded it over her arm. She didn't say anything. She looked at Stephanie once, and then she looked at the floor, and then she walked out. Joel followed her. He didn't look at anyone. "Stephanie," David said again, "did you lie to me?" She turned to him. For a moment, I thought she would try another angle, a different version of the draft explanation, or something about the pressure of the wedding timeline, or an argument about what lie really meant in this context. I had seen that particular pivot before, in other rooms, with other people. It rarely worked, but people tried it. She didn't try it. She looked at David, and she said nothing. That silence lasted long enough that it became its own answer. I'd been watching my son's face for 36 years. I had watched it at 6 years old when he broke a window and decided to tell me about it before I found out. I'd watched it at 19 when he called me from a job site to say he'd made an error in a load calculation and needed to fix it before the pour. He had always been a man who moved toward the truth when he encountered it, even when the truth was inconvenient, even when it cost him something. He was doing that now. I could see it happening. I said, "David, I waited until he looked at me. I didn't want to be part of your marriage. That was never my intention, but I needed you to know what was in that document, what was planned, and when the planning began." I paused. "That's all I wanted." He held my eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at Stephanie. "You planned this," he said. "Not a question. Before we were married, you planned what would happen if we divorced." Stephanie said, "Everyone plans for contingencies. That's what a prenup is." "A contingency," David said, "is not the same as a trap." Rachel spoke, then measured, as she had been throughout. "Mr. Brennan, if you would like to proceed, there are several options available. The prenuptial agreement as executed can be voided in full, given the circumstances of its preparation and the material misrepresentation involved. Alternatively, if both parties are willing, we can draft a new agreement, one that reflects terms both of you have actually reviewed and understood." She did not editorialize. She simply laid the options on the table the way she had laid every other document precisely, without ceremony. David looked at Rachel. Then he looked at Marcus, who was now sitting very still with his pen on the table in front of him. Then he looked at me. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my decision to make, and I had known that from the beginning. The only thing I had ever wanted was for him to be standing in a room where the truth was visible. What he did with it was his. Stephanie said quietly, "David, we can talk about this. Just the two of us. Not here." He looked at her for a long moment. The overhead light held steady. "I know what I need to know," he said. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't say it with anger, or with the particular bitterness that sometimes comes when someone discovers they have been deceived by a person they trusted completely. He said it the way he said most things clearly, and with the understanding that once said, it couldn't be unsaid. I picked up the water glass again. It was empty. I set it back down. Stephanie left first. She didn't look at David when she stood. She gathered her bag from the chair beside her, a deliberate motion, unhurried, as if she were leaving a meeting that had simply run long, and walked to the door without speaking. Marcus Webb followed her into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I watched her pull out her phone before she'd taken 3 steps. She was already dialing. Marcus caught up to her and said something. She shook her head. He said something else. She shook her head again, and then she turned away from him and continued down the hall toward the elevator. Marcus stood in the corridor for a moment. his folder still open in his hand, before he closed it and followed her. I had been in enough of these rooms to know what that phone call would sound like. She would ask what her options were. He would tell her the truth, which was that page 4 had closed most of them. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. David was still sitting at the conference table. He had the prenup in front of him, not the full document, just page 4, which Rachel had separated from the rest and left beside his water glass. He was reading it again. I could tell from the stillness of his posture that this was not the first time he'd read it in the last 10 minutes. He was reading it the way a person reads something they understand completely and wish they didn't. I waited in the doorway. Rachel was at the credenza behind him, organizing the documents back into their folders with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that the minutes immediately after a proceeding are not the time for conversation. She glanced at me once. I nodded toward the table. She finished what she was doing and stepped out past me without a word, pulling the door to, leaving it open just enough that it didn't latch. I walked back to the table and sat down beside my son. He didn't look up. I put my hand on his shoulder. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the document in front of him hadn't already said more precisely than I could. He was 36 years old and had spent the last 4 years building a life with someone who had drafted the terms of its dissolution before the wedding invitations were printed. That was not something a father could explain away or soften or reframe into a lesson. It was simply what had happened. After a while, he said, "Dad, I don't know what to do." "You'll figure it out," I said. "But this time, you'll have my support while you do." He nodded once, slowly. He folded page 4 back along its crease and set it on top of the stack. Rachel appeared in the doorway. She had her coat over her arm. "You have 30 days, she said. She wasn't speaking to me. "To decide how you want to proceed, whether that's dissolution or something else. The timeline starts now. There's no rush today." David looked up at her. "I need time to think." "That's exactly right," she said. "Take it." She left. David and I sat in the conference room for a while longer. The building had gotten quieter around us, the end of a business day settling in, the particular hush of a floor where most people had already gone home. At some point, David reached over and straightened the stack of documents in front of him, aligning the edges against the table. It was the same gesture I had watched him make as a child at the drafting table in my office, when he was still small enough that his feet didn't reach the floor, straightening his pencils, his paper, whatever was in front of him, before he began. I didn't say anything about that either. I just sat with him until he was ready to stand. If you've ever watched someone you love sit with something they couldn't fix, yet not broken, just unresolved, the way certain things have to be, you already know what that room felt like and why I stayed. These are the stories I keep coming back to. If they find something true in you, I'll be here.